Here we go. Okay, welcome everybody. We've got a nice mix of people here today from more than just South Africa. So welcome to everybody. Worldsview Academy started doing these OD talks right at the beginning of the lockdown because we used to host a cafe once a month where we had people come in and talk and meet and have coffee and have breakfast together. And it was our favorite day of the month every month. And when we realized we couldn't do it anymore, we thought, well, we mustn't stop. We must find a way to keep on with this tradition of ours for us to learn and for other people to come and learn and just to meet. And it's virtual networking, but it's still networking. You know, you can catch names on the participant list and go connect with them on LinkedIn afterwards if you want it, or during the session. So welcome. David, I was reading your profile on LinkedIn. And what struck me is that you seem to be passionate about the same stuff that we are, to help people be the most informed person in the room. I just thought, oh my goodness, that is so amazing, because that's one of the reasons we host these talks in these cafes, is that so that everybody can learn together and maybe feel a little bit more confident afterwards, but also just to have a platform where we can pick each other's brains and ask questions and so thank you for being here. I see also that your areas of interest are right up our alley. It's all the OD stuff and the leadership stuff and developing managers, developing people. So I'm really looking forward to it. You're welcome to expand a little bit on what you do. When you go, and I'm going to hand over to Chris to just quickly some logistics to everybody else. If you have questions throughout this session, we're quite a few people, 38. So we're going to ask that you type them in the chat function. And between me and Krista, we'll keep an eye on the chat function so that David doesn't have to pay attention to that. And then we'll bring up your questions. And probably at the end, we'll have 20 to 30 minutes to have more of a conversation if you can hang around. Okay. So thanks so much. And over to you, Christy and David.
Cool. Thanks, Liesel. Yeah, David, it's really nice that we have this conversation. I became aware of the Oxford Review probably 2 or 3 years ago, getting it in my inbox frequently. And as I said to you yesterday, I'm thinking that if there's one place I need to go to just find out anything I want in the field that's interesting and get a sense of the lay of the land and what's happening in the research. Don't have to look further than the Oxford Review. And about organization development, the HR, it's HR as well. But what's really interesting for me is the key good resource for organization development. And if you're interested, Oxford Review, we'll put the website and the Twitter handle and all of those things into the chat box just now, so that you can follow that. So thank you for that. Tell us a little bit about how the Oxford Review came into existence.
It was a big accident. So I took a sabbatical to write a book. So I've always been kind of a pracademic. So whilst lecturer, I used to run department and various other bits and pieces. But I also used to do quite a lot of consultancy work, and the university that I was running the department in at Cranfield University used to encourage people to do consultancy work as well as their academic research and work. And so I took a sabbatical to finish off writing a book. And but I know as a consultant what it's like. if you disappear from people's view, it's like you didn't exist in the first place. So I thought, you know, I need to keep my name in front of these people who are my clients. How am I going to do that? So just while I was writing the book, because it was based on research, every couple of weeks, I just used to send out a little email just saying, look, I found these little snippets of research whilst I've been writing the book, basically saying, hello, don't forget me, without saying it. And I just did that for 6 months. And then it was Christmas Eve, actually, 2016, 15. And I kind of looked in the bank account and realized I needed to get back to some work. And I kind of sent out an email on Christmas Eve before I did my Christmas shopping, you know, typical bloke thing. And I just sent out an email saying, look, I'm back in the new year. If you've got any interesting projects, let me know and I'll stop sending these silly emails to you. And that was it. I went into town, into Oxford, did my usual thing. I met up with some, or I was going to meet up with some friends in a cafe at the end over some old wine and stuff. And I got there early and I thought I'd just check my phone. And there was like over 300 emails in my inbox. And I thought at first that it was just everybody's out of office notifications or, you know, spam or something. So I thought I'll just delete them while I'm waiting for my friends. And it wasn't. It was all these people saying, don't stop the emails. We love them. And I was like, what? So Christmas Day, my mind's like whirring. And on Boxing, this is how sad I am, on Boxing Day, I sent out another email saying, well, yeah, okay, but I've got to eat. Are you prepared to pay? And I got virtually all of the responses back saying, yeah. And January the 2nd, 2016, the review was born, and it's just gone from strength to strength. You know, we've got organizations like the United Nations, the Bank of England, areas, believe it or not, of the State Department. We've got everything from large health services right down to a group of caravan parks in Australia. And it's just gone bang like that. I was, you know, it's been a journey.
That's incredible.
I know.
It's incredible. If you look at the landscape of research in this field at the moment, what are some of the things that stand out for you? That jumps out. This is kind of pertinent. This is urgent, and there's a lot of this.
Yeah, I think there's in terms of topics, I think there's a couple of topics that have kind of really coming to the fore and are kind of growing apace. Things around agile are just exponential. You know, the amount of research that we're seeing is just huge. Ideas around what's known as organizational ambidexterity. This idea about organizations being able to innovate and create new business models, new products, new services at the same time as exploiting their existing ones. And that's no mean feat. The research is showing in that area that usually the same people aren't very good at doing both. So at the moment, the way that the research is kind of heading for that is that organizations need to manage that. So having departments that are good at the exploitation, sales, keeping the current stuff going, and having a department or having people involved in the more experimental, creative side. So they're the kinds of things that are really kind of exploding. Leadership management are always kind of on the horizon, and then with COVID and the pandemic, was, you know, there's been a real rush of studies again looking at how to deal with uncertainty, how to cope both as an individual, so through psychology, management, leadership, and those kinds of things, but also organizationally, and what organizations need to do in order to just, well, survive first, and then actually come out of this with a series of opportunities and grow rather than going. And I did a big paper. We scanned about 3,500 papers looking at business pivots and how organizations change direction when their old market dies or the marketplace goes flat, and what the success factors are for a business pivot. So pivoting's become quite popular, as has entrepreneurialism. Lots of people being made redundant and losing their jobs right across the world, and they're turning to the gig economy. So we're seeing more research coming out around those factors and what they call digital labor. So people who are operating through a lot of these platforms, things like People Per Hour, Upwork, and those kinds of platforms, and just grabbing jobs where and when they can. So they're the kinds of trends that we're seeing. And
it's very interesting.
Sorry, go on.
It's very interesting. They seem to be related. I mean, agile and ambidexterity was the pre-COVID response to massive uncertainty, and it doesn't help that we pretend that it's only COVID that brought uncertainty into our world. Our world has been uncertain for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and the pace of change has picked up. There was an interesting study done probably about 4 or 5 years ago at the Max Planck Institute, looking at the rate of change and whether it was really increasing or not. And what they did was they looked at patents and published research in terms of actual new ideas in published research to see whether there was an increase in this. And they were able to track it, and I can't remember the exact dates, but they showed that the amount of increase in change up until it was something like 1925 was roughly running at about somewhere about 5% per year. Anyway, it's kind of sprung in the last few years up to about 9%. So there's a 9% increase in knowledge per year. And right now, because I get to see all the research right now, there's roughly about 105,000 peer-reviewed papers published every month. That's across the, I know, that's across the piece. Now, in our areas to do with OD, learning, leadership, management, HR, and all those kind of work psychology and the things that we cover, there's roughly about 200 to 250 papers every 24 hours being published.
That is just overwhelming.
Yeah, and that's what we get to see. And there's 247 research databases that are the main research databases, and we get to see into each of them. And that's roughly what's coming out at the moment, around about 200 to 250 papers every 24 hours in those areas. It's astonishing.
It's interesting because in a way we're in a position where what is supposed to give us a little bit more certainty is actually making us more uncertain. Because if we just know there's all of this research out there that we can't consume, that we can't cope with, we just feel more and more uninformed, which is where you step in, thankfully for us. But it's also a general condition of people's uncertainty. Is to a certain extent, we actually know how uncertain we are, whereas perhaps in earlier times, we could comfortably live with this illusion that, well, you know, we know the basics, we know how to get around, we sort of can expect what's going to happen, and we have a few pet theories that are comfortable and stable and so on.
Yeah, and a lot of those theories actually aren't true and are out of date, so we do quite a lot of myth busting. So, you know, you get things like I hear it, I still hear it, the whole thing about 70% of change projects failing. It's not true. And it actually came from a whole series of things that occurred between papers, and it was never published research. So we get a lot of that kind of stuff going on, and it's that amount of information becomes overwhelming. And as human beings, the question is, where do I start and what do I look at? And quite a lot of people just give up and say, well, I can't cope, so I don't look. Which now, with the tools that we've got, the technology, the digital tools and things, we can curate things. So a lot of the work that we do is done digitally. We use AI. When we're looking at papers, we load all the papers into an AI engine, and it shows us where all the concordances are, and it kind of draws a mind map for us, and we can see where the hotspots and things are. And you know, I don't need to go in and try to work it all out. It does it for me. And then what we do is then we go in and make sense of it. So there are a lot of tools for that curation. And, you know, you'll have a news website, and there'll be, you know, if you go into Apple News or Google News or any of these others, they'll say, what are the topics you're interested in? And that's just a curation process. And the more that we use the curation process, and there's advantages and disadvantages, the more that we can cope and the more that we can get the pertinent information that we need. One of the disadvantages, and we're seeing this in terms of news, is that a lot of these websites, what you end up not seeing becomes the problem. So these data and things, the research that actually would be really useful, and we find with a membership, for example, is that because we cover that kind of broad church of anything to do with organizations and people, you know, when people join, they say, I only want the stuff about teams, and I'm going, but you don't. And they go, yes, I do. Oh, no, you don't. Trust me. And within a couple of weeks, I usually get an email saying, oh yeah, I get what you mean, because it's all interconnected, and you start to see connections and you go, and it's that, what you were talking about earlier about learning, is that those kind of realizations that we get from putting a couple of things together that becomes quite important.
Yeah. It's a capacity to see real patterns.
Yes.
See real links.
And that's that capacity to see patterns is emerging as a real skill in complexity.
Yeah.
What we're looking for are emergent properties, particularly in uncertainty. So the people who are good at pattern spotting, who are good at sitting back and seeing these patterns, what we call the emergent properties, are actually very, very valuable to organizations. And it's a skill, but it also requires a mindset, and what we'll be talking about shortly, I'm sure, you know.
I actually want to jump in there immediately, because that sounds, I mean, our topic to an extent is uncertainty and emotional intelligence. And there's a very clear link between your capacity to stay alert and to see patterns and to not get sucked into the mess of the overly present.
Yeah.
And that requires emotional maturity. That requires emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
What is, and this is not just your research this is not just what you're picking up through your work through the Oxford Review. This is a key concern for you in your professional life, is the link between emotional intelligence and uncertainty, and what happens in uncertainty.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research showing that there's a strong link between what we call emotion regulation skills, so the ability to be able to, so what we would term emotional intelligence, and emotional literacy, so our ability to be able to work out what we're feeling, how we're reacting emotionally to things, and how we react ourselves to uncertain situations or certain situations or something that happens that's unexpected. So there's a very close link between what we call our affect, so the emotional response, and our emotional response to things comes from a whole kind of cluster of things like our values. So our values inform how we react. Our beliefs about the world, so things like prejudices, biases, but a whole series of other world beliefs that we have, and the way that we think, our cognitions, kind of all cluster together in order to produce an emotional impact from an event. So, which is why we see, you know, there can be you just look what's happening in South Africa, you know, with the tobacco and the alcohol bans, or you go, you know, across the Atlantic to some of the things that are going on there politically, or any other kind of incident. What you'll see is there's this huge range of reactions, emotional reactions. Some people are more emotional, some people are less emotional, but the range of reactions to a particular is huge. And the question is, why is that? And what we're starting to see and what we now know is that it's that combination of the values that we have, our own individual values, our beliefs, the way that we think, how we think, slightly different. So our cognitions and our emotional responses. So, and that really informs what's going on, and we can see so some of the research that I was involved in a few years ago, we were looking at kind of demographics of reactions to uncertainty. And if I can just share this, so we see that, you know, in terms of uncertainty, we see people who prefer certainty and prefer to work in situations of certainty, and people who prefer chaos. They like situations of uncertainty. And in fact, one of the activities I often do in organizations is I do an exercise called the 4 corners exercise. What I do is I just put flip charts up in the 4 corners of the room with a group of people. I've run this with actually a couple of thousand people, actually, which was interesting. So one corner is marked certainty, vagueness, chaos, risk. And I get people to go and stand in the corner that they feel most comfortable in, and the corner that they would prefer to work in on a day-to-day basis. And as you can well imagine, what we find is the biggest clump usually, depends on the industry, usually is sat in certainty. If you do it in some industries, so if you do it with police officers, for example, they're usually sat around here, so chaos and risk. Very few people actually like vague situations. So that's the first part of the exercise. Where do you prefer? So we get most people stood here across the population. And then if you say, well, where would you least like to be? And then what happens is most people gather around here. They don't like vague situations. So because it's a bit like trying to plat fog. You can't quite, you're not getting direct feedback from anything. And the high uncertainty is here and here in chaos. So the difference between these in terms of, I suppose, academic difference or, well, real difference is that in certainty, there's what we call close coupling between cause and effect. You do something and something else happens predictably. So you can predict what's going on. As we kind of move round and down to chaos, in chaos, you can do something and the same thing is not going to happen time and time again. So you can keep doing the same thing, but you're getting a different response every time. And in vagueness, what's happening is you can do something and you're not sure what you're getting. And that's the problem and people seem to be more uncomfortable here, bizarrely, than here. So a lot of creatives love this and they like what they term chaos. Particularly what they like is that they like because it allows them to be creative, and what they actually are enjoying doing is turning order out of chaos. They like reducing the chaos. So that's kind of what we're seeing. And in terms of demographics, what we see across the population is this kind of demographic going on, where there's quite a lot of people who prefer high levels of certainty, but most people like a bit of uncertainty. And we'll have a look at why in a minute. But as we kind of move through the population, here, the people who actually really prefer uncertainty and including vagueness, usually we're talking about naturally 2% of the population. So quite low numbers, but they're the kind of masters of ambiguity, as it were.
Do you see a correlation between preference, specifically I prefer that, and not necessarily preference, but I'm just comfortable with vagueness, can deal very well with vagueness, wouldn't want to be in vagueness all the time, but But when it's vague, it's vague.
Yeah. So this 2%, that the 2% are usually comfortable in things like chaos, risk, vagueness. They get very uncomfortable in certainty. They find it boring, and they don't enjoy it. They feel like they're being kind of stealthified, as much like that kind of sense. So that, and there are definite preferences, but it also depends on where the change or the uncertainty is coming from. So what we find is, if the risk, if the vagueness or the uncertainty is something that we've brought about, so this thing about people don't like change isn't true. We do like change. We like a new car. We like a new house, as long as we weren't turfed out of the last one. So if we've got control, what we find is people are quite happy with that kind of change and that level of uncertainty, because they feel like there isn't much uncertainty. But if they
I chose.
Sorry?
Uncertainty I chose.
Yeah.
Got a boundary.
It's not because it's mine. But if it out of their control, and somebody else or some other situation like COVID or the government or somebody else is controlling that, then we have a completely different reaction to it. And there's a really good, let me just share this video with you, that shows this. I don't know about you, but this leaves me in abject horror. Right. So this is a couple of kids who've climbed up, the cooling stacks in power stations.
Yeah.
Right. Can you see how high they are? Can you see the screen? Right. Let me just play the video. It'll start in a second. Right. This is about perceptions of risk.
I consider myself someone quite comfortable with uncertainty and risk, but
wait till you see the second clip. So these two kids have climbed up here for fun, right? So, and it's what they do as a hobby. They kind of, I survived. Look at this. Anyway, I'll stop it there. So we see a different.
Do you have anything before you go there? Something that rises up for me is this a matter of wiring? Where does this come from? This predilection for certain kinds of risks versus other kinds of risks, and comfort with risk and discomfort with risk, and desire for chaos, and etc. That in itself seems like something that's potentially quite complex.
Yeah, it is very complex. So there is some evidence of some genetic indicators in that, but we also know that there are, experience. There are social issues. So if we're in a society, so a group of people who are risk takers, we're much more likely to move towards that. We're very social learners, and we tend to take on what's around us, and the kinds of people around. So if we've got like a family that are risk takers or not risk takers, that has an impact. Then all of the factors that I was talking about before, the kind of values, our beliefs, our emotional reaction to things. And you just think about my emotional reaction to that is like, so like the chances of me going up there. And I like heights. I actually do like heights, but the thought of walking around that with that and then juggling, like, whoa. But that's just, clearly they survived, unless we picked up the camera. Well, no, I know they posted it. So,
yeah, there's lots of people that do crazy stuff like that.
I know. I know. And so we get this range of risk appetite that comes from this mix of all of these things, and we can learn. So what we find is, you just think about the older generation who were like in the war, for example, and that level of risk. And I'm fascinated by people who were, in the First World War, the soldiers in the First World War, and what that must be like. From my safe, I'm ex-military, I'm ex-army, but the thought of that kind of carnage and just like what, and it's I just find that really interesting, but astonishing that people can be, I suppose, persuaded to engage in that kind of activity, but it becomes norm for a whole social group. And the more normal it becomes, we're very adaptable as creatures. The more normal it becomes, the more we can and this is how whole populations slide into different fashions and things. And we see it politically. You just look at what happened in Germany in the 1930s, and it normalizes all this behavior that, on reflection or outside of that system, we're kind of going, what?
It's an interesting thing, because there's also, I guess, I'm engaging at the moment with Bessel van der Kolk's writing about trauma. And there's also something in high-risk behavior that's almost like a reaction to traumatization that fixes, because it's the only place where you feel alive, and as a collective thing, it can escalate and become very, very troublesome. We also, yesterday when we spoke about Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and the understanding of how people actually engage with situations that are so extreme and so out of the ordinary. And why some people manage to come out of that alive, in the broader sense of being alive, having a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning, and some people may come out of that either numb or in a space where they seek out. And it's got to do, something about it has got to do with this deep sense of uncertainty. There's like everything in your life that has been somewhat certain has been ripped away. And you need to actually really make sense of conditions where your normal capacity to resort to at least some stable things is not there for you anymore.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of research around resilience, obviously, but there's clearly a kind of, there's an argument at the moment about mindsets and whether they actually exist or not, but there's clearly a set of thinking and values and beliefs and attitudes and emotional reactions that make people more likely to survive, and there are a set that make people less likely to survive in those kinds of conditions. Now, obviously, apart from the gas chambers, that's a different kind of issue, but within the situation, and certainly some of the stuff that I'm thinking around at the moment, and have been for a little while, is around kind of the victim mentality, where people feel victimized as a pattern of behavior, and the effect that has on their resilience and ability to be able to be resourceful in a difficult situation or an uncertain situation. And people who either see it as a challenge, and challenges are seen as good things. So there's a set of values there around challenges, and a set of beliefs, but also opportunity seeking individuals. So this kind of entrepreneurial trait that people go into a situation with a more positive mindset, that's not a victim mindset, this is being done to me, is what can I take control of, and what can I do with this situation? and they have completely different outcomes. And when we did some, this is kind of a little bit going off on a tangent, but it's about problem solving. And some of the work that I did in the early 2000s around problem solving to do with uncertainty, and how the people, what we call generative leaders, the people who are really good, or generative people, the people who are really good with uncertainty, who are creative, what they do is a form of, I suppose, reality check. What they're trying to do in any situation is to try to work out what's actually going on, rather than having an emotional reaction. They're aware of their emotions, and they have emotion regulation capability, so that they can regulate their own emotions, so that it's not just a reaction. And they operate in difficult situations and uncertain situations in terms of problem solving in a very, very different way. Let me just, I can do this graphically. Actually, this actually came from somebody I was doing some work with, who was a physicist, and we kind of sat down together and did some stuff. So in terms of problems, we'll just do it this way. Hang on. So this here is a timeline. So we'll just put time there, heading off in that direction. Right. So the main thing here is about problems. So when a problem occurs, all right, so that's the actual, oops, that's the actual, what we call P1. So that's the moment at which the problem occurs. Now, the thing with virtually all problems, the moment they occur, we as humans will not notice it. So, for example, if you get a virus, the very moment that virus comes inside you, you won't notice that. You know, and this is why COVID is a problem, because there's a 2-week incubation period. You know, if there's a problem occurs with your car, you don't notice the problem. We never notice a problem. You know, the financial crash of 2007, 2008 goes back years. There's a whole series of things that occurred that came together. What we actually notice, and this is the critical point, and this is the point for organizations, the thing that we notice is, oops, not sure why that's happened. Hang on. Yeah, that'll do. The thing that we notice are the symptoms. We always notice the symptoms, but we think that that's the problem. So, for example, we get a stomach ache and we go to the doctor with a stomach ache. The doctor understands that to us, it's a problem. The problem is a stomach ache, or the problem is my car's not working, or it's making a noise, or whatever. The mechanic, the doctor understands that actually that's not the problem. It's just a set of symptoms. Now, the issue here is that there's always, and I mean always, a time lag between a problem occurring and the symptoms being noticed. And the more complex the problem or set of problems that lead to the symptoms, like the financial crash, right, or COVID, for example, becoming a pandemic, not the actual thing, but even the thing itself, you know, is this time lag. And what's happening here? Now, what's actually happening in that space there is that the situation getting worse. So in terms of trajectory of the issue from the problem, the situation is getting worse. But we're seeing the problem in I've just got a stomach ache and it's getting worse, right? So I go to the doctor. The doctor now is trying to backtrack to try and work out what might have caused it. You know, is it something that this person ate? Is it a virus? It could be a whole load of things. Is it something actually physical in there? Have they got cancer? Could be anything, right? So they're trying to, from the set of symptoms, trying to work out what the problem is. Now, in terms of human beings, there's a great gray area here. So what we're now starting to see is a branch of medicine where they'll try something. They'll say, here, take this tablet. If it doesn't work, come back and see me in a week. at which point we're down here. The stomach's, our stomach aches worse. Okay, try this. We'll try the next thing. So we have this series of potential solutions, and then if one does work, we then say, okay, that must have been the problem. So
it's quite reactive. It's a quite reactive approach. It's like deal at hand.
Yeah, and we're seeing a lot of that in medicine, and organizations kind of do that kind of experimental diagnosis, I suppose, of what's going on. So we've got this kind of gap here. The problem for organizations, if we're talking about organizational development and organizational problems, is that the problems that they're dealing with are complex, usually. It's not just one thing. Sales going down, as human beings, we try to make things simple and we just say, oh, it's COVID, it's the marketplace, it's, that may be, but there may be a whole series of other things as well that are involved. And unpicking that becomes very, very difficult. So the thing that I discovered was this. Usually, what most people are trying to do when they're using this term, solving a problem, let's just... what does that actually mean to most people, this idea of solving a problem? Now, to most people, what that actually means is to move it back to how it was before the problem occurred, right? To get back to this line here, and preferably to get back to some kind of situation back here where, before in a space before the problem occurred.
It's our desire to re-establish normal, and then we'll call it the new normal.
Yeah, well, you can't go back.
What we actually want is just the old normal in new time.
Yeah. And we saw that during the banking crisis. A lot of bankers, a lot of politicians, they were even talking about when it gets back to normal. It will never go back to how it was, no matter where we are, because this thing has occurred. And this thing is part of the history now. And that means that our new world is a different place. And it is always a different place. It's never the same. What's happening now, whilst there may be analogies with the plague or with anything else in terms of COVID, it's not the same. It's very different because we've got technology, we've got communications technology that we didn't have, we've got scientific technology, medical tech. The context is always different, always different. So we're not going back. You can't turn back time. We don't have a time machine, and we're fairly certain in terms of astrophysics that time travel backwards isn't possible. Right. And certainly I don't know of any organizations that can do that. And if anybody knows of one, please let me know, because I'd be delighted to find one. So the idea here of solving a problem, the first problem that we have is usually they're trying to solve the symptoms. Organizations are trying to solve the symptoms, they're not trying to solve the problem. Right? Trying to go back and do some kind of critical incident analysis usually is so complex, it's very, very difficult. And frequently, and scientists get this, trying to find causal effect is notoriously hard and fraught with difficulty. And, any scientist worth their salt is not going to stake a claim on this causes that. They do confidence intervals. They say, look, there's a relationship here. We don't know whether it's causal, or yes, this is one part of the problem. This explains 25% of the variance in the data, So even then, they're saying it's only a small part of it. I've yet to see a reputable study that goes, this explains 100% of the data, because there's so many variables involved. Right. So let's just have a look at what I'm going to call them true entrepreneurs, which isn't right, but it gets the idea. So what good entrepreneurs, what people who are good with uncertainty do in these situations. The first thing is they recognize that what they're looking at is a symptom, not the problem. And that's really important. They get that. They're not even going to try to go back and try and work out what it is, because they know that they may find some of it. Sometimes they will, but unless it's quick and easy and they go, yeah, okay, I can solve that, that's fine.
There's so much for root cause analysis and all of that stuff.
Well, yeah, it's fine. You know, in certain circumstances, the trouble with it is this is moving on. The symptoms are kind of progressing, and actually they're progressing in this direction. So, and that's kind of the problem. And also this mindset that we're going to get back to how it was.
Yeah.
You know, forget it. So what these people do, so that's the first thing they do, is they say, right, okay, I'm dealing with the symptoms here. I get that, right? The second thing I'm dealing with is me. What I'm seeing here is my perspective, and it may not be real. And that's quite important, because quite a lot of us believe what we see and hear. And I'll show you in a minute that that's not true. So what they do is they make the assumption that it's what they're seeing is just one perspective. And then now what they're going to do is they're going to engage in a process of fact finding. And they're going to do that in a way by kind of going around. It's like a 360. They're going to start asking other people. They're going to try to see what data there is out there about, not about the problem, but about what's actually happening. What impact this is having right now. Right. So, and then what they do is once they've worked out what they think they know what is going on, they're now opportunity seeking. They're now going, okay, so what can I do with this? And what they're actually, where they're doing with this is, so if we look at this in terms of down here, negative, and up here, positive energy, and this is where this physicist came in. He was talking in terms of energy, which kind of blew my mind at the time. What now happens is that these people looking at the symptoms, like they may do a bit of this, but what they're really trying to do is say, right, okay, well, what can I do with this? Where can I go given this situation? And, you know, you look at the COVID situation, you look at organizations that pivoted really quickly. So in the UK, for example, one of my favorite restaurants, Leon, right? What they did very, very quickly, they realized they shut all their restaurants down, all their cafes down around the UK. And they said, right, okay, we're going to turn them into supermarkets because we've got all this supply chain. And then they realized that people couldn't actually get into the cities where they're mainly thing. So they then started supplying supermarkets with firstly the raw product, and then they said, actually, we can cook some of this, we can turn it into kits for making our food, and then they supplied that to local supermarkets around the layer. Like, that's pivoting. That's this from this situation. Now there are times, obviously, you know, I'm not advocating this in like 100% of the situation, but we need both of these things. Firstly, we need to work out that largely what we're dealing with in organizations are symptoms and not problems. That's the first issue. Some of them are fairly simple and we can solve. You know, we can just say, right, okay, you know, if that person's stealing from us, we need to get rid of them. That's fine. I get that. That's not a problem, right? But in terms of complex problems, in terms of things like the uncertainty that we're facing right now and those kinds of things, this kind of, where are we really at? What's really happening? They do that very quickly, and then, okay, what do we do now? Where do we move from here in order to find something that we can do with this? And this is the basis of the pivot, really.
So David, in organizations, as they collectively deal with crises, and they actually have to pivot, because that's what you have to do in the crisis. You can't just stay the same. There's lots of things that gets in the way of what I hear you saying here is you have to get there where you are, in the moment there where you are, and you have to face reality. You have to get a grip on what is. And you must look at fact finding, and fact finding is not just backwards. It's not just into the past, into what has caused this, but it's also fact finding into what is actually unfolding.
Yeah.
And then within this, you need to stay open to opportunity. Now, I guess what happens in a lot of organizations is that in that moment of crisis, they get fixated. They want to go back to the past. They closed down access to what is actually happening in reality because of this desperate need to see what they want to see, and they get stuck.
Yeah.
As a whole system, they get stuck.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious about then is this emotional component in it, because whether as an individual or as a collective of individuals, there are very clear emotional components to your capacity to be entrepreneurial. And I mean this really for people inside big organizations and people who are going outside. Entrepreneurial, I think, in the way that you use it almost as an attitude rather than as a specific role or property of people.
Yeah, in a crisis, being able to do this rather than reacting emotionally and starting to shut things down and going into a poor me kind of situation. So as an organization saying, oh, we're just going to have to shut everybody down. We're going to have to, rather than saying, okay, right, what have we got? What's really happening here? And what are the opportunities that we've got from here? And, I've seen some amazing pivots during the COVID crisis of businesses completely pivoting out of where they are and what they were manufacturing before, and moving into things like, making masks, making components for respirators, or something else that they can actually sell, or some other way. Now that pivot becomes difficult, and I know I've done it myself, where we hold on to what we've got. And that's an emotional reaction. It's like, I don't want to give this up because I've spent 10 years building this up of my life. Well, okay, maybe now's just time to move on. And I've done this. I did this with one of my businesses where it hung around. It would have been better just to put it out of its misery because it was taking up airspace in my head, when actually it wasn't a viable model. But I'd invested so much in it, I wasn't going to let it go. And that was an emotional attachment I had to all this work that I'd done for it. And even now, I was thinking about it yesterday, thinking, I wonder, and I go, whoa, stop. No, like, you're on a good thing here. Keep pushing this one. And it's
interesting. We think of sunk cost fallacy as a cognitive and as an intellectual mistake or error.
Yeah.
In fact, it's rooted in this emotional thing of holding on and the desire for certainty, and I couldn't have wasted all my time, and there's really emotional issues with that.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're seeing in terms of organizational development and creating this ability, this agility to be able to move, is having agile resources, strategically agile resources. So resources that we can move around, and people that we can move around and put into. We're seeing this a lot more in matrix organizations where you'll be in different project groups, not just one. You'll be spreading your expertise across 5 or 6 different project groups. You'll go into those project groups, help with your expertise, and then move on to the next one. And lots of people are doing this. So this kind of resource agility is becoming critical in organizations, so that the people and the functions can move around. Now, once you've got that agility, that resource agility, you can engage in these kinds of things in the moment of a crisis. You can actually start shifting things around. And in fact, one of the things I was going to show you, let me just stop that for a second and see if I can find, yeah, here we go. I made a comment a little bit earlier on about, we tend to believe what we see and hear, right? We have this model in our heads, most of us, that the information comes in from the outside world, like it is just right now, and it comes into our brain, and that, and it's a pretty good representation. So what I'm seeing, what I think I'm seeing, and what I'm seeing are the same thing. We assume. Let me just show you this. This is a very classical illusion, but it's more than illusion because it's actually saying something about the way our brains work. And it's called the hollow mask illusion. I show this to students, I don't know, 30 times a year, and I still can't get this to work. So as this is a mask, and as it rotates, what will happen is the face will pop out. Yeah. And that's because our brain knows that people cannot have concave faces. You've never come across anybody with a face that goes in. It doesn't exist, right? So what our brain does is it imposes order on the world. So what we think we're seeing and what is actually going on out there are two different things. We have this, you know, and you'll see it again. As I say, I've watched this thousands of times. I cannot get that face to go in. And that's our brain imposing order on the world.
Yeah, even if your brain still does it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's this model here. We have this perception that we're seeing the outside world. It's coming in through the senses and going into our brain. Well, actually, it's working in both directions. And I can show you that again. This is a thing called the McGurk effect. And this is you'll have to listen to this. And the question is, what is this guy saying? Right, now what I want you to do is we'll play it again. I'll just click off it so it comes. I'll play it again. This time I want you to shut your eyes. Don't look at the screen and work out what you think he's saying. So is he saying far or is he saying bar? Because he seems to be saying the two things, right? So let's just go. Notice what happens when you close your eyes. And then open your eyes. Can you see how the moment you look at the time that he's going, even though he's saying bar, you hear far? And both of those are really good examples of our brain imposing order on the world. And it does it in big ways as well. So, you know, we have a whole series of biases that are based on these ideas where we think we know what we're seeing, we think we know what we know. And that's why it's so powerful. A lot of what these people are doing is that they're going out and collecting data. They're testing whether what they think is happening is really happening. Very few people do that.
So, David, I'm curious. So these cognitive operations, they're taking place. They're shaped by our emotions, and we respond or react in the world on the basis of this. And we are more or less open or more or less stuck. And that openness or that stuckness is also very much related to the context in which we find ourselves, the organizational context. And on the basis of that, you would be able to predict that certain kinds of organizations, even before you go into a crisis, because we don't see the crisis coming ever, but we would be able to live in the world as it is and predict in the world as it is that certain companies would be able to face a crisis better and be able to pivot faster than other companies. And we ascribe this to things like culture, maybe, structure, or all sorts of organizational qualities or properties. What kind of organization, what kind of leadership does not fall in, well, is able to predictably pivot and reinvent itself?
Yeah. Okay. Largely ones with so there's a few answers to this. So the ones who are most agile, the ones who have kind of resource agility, have what we call strategic agility, who are, and this is quite a big thing that's really starting to come out. It's been around for years, but really starting to come out around what we call environmental scanning. So a lot of organizations and people in organizations are kind of caught up in their own little world. They're doing their task. They go to the office and their world is everything within the organization. So we're now seeing a lot of research showing that open innovation, and what we mean by that is going out and looking what other people are doing, and not just in our own sectors, not copying what's going on in our other sector, but looking, having a look at, I don't know, a different sector, the IT sector or the police or, health services or whatever, what are they doing? What kind of innovations are going on there? Being connected to the wider world and then saying, actually, we can use that knowledge or we can use that innovation or that way of thinking or that model and let's bring it in and let's experiment with it. And it's that kind of thinking that...
Almost like an organizational curiosity or curiosity.
Exactly. It's
quality
exactly
of the culture.
But connected to the outside world, and that they're not only focused on sales or whatever it is that they're trying to do. And what happens is we get this kind of organizational myopia that, they've got blinkers on and they only see their sector, their market and their organization, because that's what they're working in 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, or whatever it happens to be. And that then becomes the issue. So these organizations that are doing this environmental scanning tend to be the ones, and there's more and more research backing this up, tend to be the ones that are more agile anyway, because they've got kind of knowledge management processes. And I don't just mean computer systems where they're sticking stuff on, but they're thinking about innovation. There's a constant change. They're doing things like job crafting, where people have got the latitude to change their job, how they work, where they work, who they connect to within work, so they can control it. And it's not just something that's part of the structure. So, those kinds of little things make a big difference to an organization in terms of agility, in terms of their ability then to respond to either what we call a low chance, high impact event like COVID-19 that just come along once in a while, but when they do, they're hugely disruptive. If that makes sense.
And yesterday when we had a chat, I also asked you in this context, because you said that the companies that managed to pivot went into the organization, into the crisis, and the culture was already, and we specifically spoke about this desire of leadership or management to control. And I guess on that drawing that you made, that's control is this desire to pull it back to what it was. Because I'm out of control. I was once in control, and now I just need to get back into control.
Yeah.
And I would love you to tell the story. The experience in the riots, was it in 84?
Oh, yeah, 84.
What you learned there from the police response to conditions of really intense uncertainty.
Yeah. So, okay, so this goes back to the 80s. I was a police officer before all of this for 18 years. And in the early 80s in the UK, there was quite a lot of kind of disquiet, some of it to do with racial, some of it to do with housing, a lot of inequality, and it was kind of a tinderbox, and it kind of blew up in the early 80s, and there were a series of riots around the UK. Started in Toxteth in Liverpool. We were ill prepared. Now, I'd been in the army before that. I'd been in Northern Ireland, and we were prepared. Right, we had all the kit. We knew what to do when riots happened. We had all the shields. We knew exactly how to operate. Right, the police were unprepared for the first. And I remember, so what my force did. So we have this kind of mutual aid thing. There's 43 forces in the UK, and there's this mutual aid thing where forces support each other if there's a major event. and unannounced. So we had this mutual aid, and luckily our force kind of said, right, is there anybody who's been to Northern Ireland, you know, because there are riots going on and we're about to send some people down there. We need people who've been in these situations. So I was stuck on this bus with these other ex-servicemen, and we were put in Liverpool. Now we had some kit, but there were lots of police officers there with dustbin lids and no protective kit. There was very little strategic awareness of what was going on. There were a whole load of mistakes being made in terms of the management. And what we discovered was senior managers were making decisions that had really bad series of impacts. People were being injured because of it and various other bits and pieces. As a result of that experience, as a direct result of that experience and a number of other things, the emergency services got together and they made this realization that once you'd got one of these low chance, high impact events, right, that the game had changed. In normal organizational terms, having the chief constable or having the CEO running things and doing what they do with strategy and stuff and all that, right, fine, great. But once you're out of those conditions, you're into new conditions, you need a new structure. Creating strategy on the hoof for somebody at that level, by the time they've thought about it, created the strategy, it goes into implementation, the world's moved on, it's out of date. And that was really causing the problem. So we created this gold, silver and bronze process. So it was a hierarchical process, and it was largely to stop the senior managers involving themselves at the ground level during a riot, right? Because by the time they'd got there, they'd been off the streets for too long. They weren't tactically aware. So we created this structure. And what we said was the goal commanders, the chief officers, the senior chief officers were goal commanders. Their job in a crisis is twofold. One is to set the overall aim, right? Which is, that's it, once, what's the mission of all of this? And then their job is to make sure that the people further down have got the resources. That's it. They are there to make sure everybody's got what they need in order to do their job. They are not to, and they were banned from going anywhere near any of the operational centres. So the gold commanders were never allowed anywhere near the operational silver commanders. The silver commanders were the people who had CCTV, they'd have a control room, and in that control room they had tactical advisors. They'd have a firearms advisor who would be a PC or a sergeant. They'd have a public order advisor who would be a PC or a sergeant. These are people who were used to being on the streets, who knew how to make minute-to-minute decisions and knew how to run the tactics as advisors to these commanders. And what we'd done in that moment by doing that is saying to these middle managers, you are not the expert. You may be the expert in managing, but you're not the expert in these particular sets of circumstances. You listen to these people. They are. This person is a firearms officer and has huge experience in this area, and you need to listen to them. So we created a structure so they had to. By removing gold, so they weren't being harassed by gold, silver would ask for a resource, gold would supply it, no questions asked. And then what we had were the bronze commanders, who were largely the inspectors and sergeants on the street, behind the shields, who had a group of police officers, radios. So they knew exactly what they were doing in that particular set of circumstances. But for the overview, the silver commander would say, okay, we need to withdraw here, or we need to move down those streets. And then the bronze commanders would work out how to do it. So there wouldn't be micromanagement. And that was done as a direct result of our experiences. So this whole kind of gold, silver and bronze started to emerge out of there. And what it was trying to do was separate out the responsibilities of the people. And what we find in emergencies in organizations is the senior management start micromanaging and getting involved in operational decisions that actually they're not expert in anymore. And it's the people on the ground that need to make those decisions. They know their own environment. And one of the things, in fact, there's a paper just published 3 weeks ago, from a medic who was involved in the earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand, in the hospital there. And what they learned from that is, in those kinds of situations, you've got to trust your people, and you give them greater autonomy in an emergency situation. You let them make the decisions. And this structure, what it did is it created a process that really cemented that idea of, you know, the bronze commanders, the people down on the ground, they make their decisions. But because they're there, they know what it feels like to have petrol bombs. You know, if it becomes overwhelming, having somebody else further up saying, don't move back, you know, you're going to lose. Well, we saw that during the war. You just look at some of the decisions Hitler made. They're just ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's the right decision at the right moment, and it changes in an emergency decision, in an emergency situation. The structure needs to change, and the decision making needs to change, and it needs to flow down to the people who are actually being impacted. Because what we're doing in an emergency situation is that we're operating, because it's an uncertain world. We don't know. This has never happened before. There are similarities, but this particular incident, whatever it is different. And it operates off feedback, instant, immediate feedback. So we'll try something. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And that's why the people on the ground need the autonomy to be able to experiment, to try things, and then to move back with somebody just having an overall, okay, don't go down there, don't do this, just kind of guiding without micromanaging. And it's a new world situation once you're into an emergency. And you've really got to trust your people. Centralized control very, very rarely works in those kinds of conditions.
It's fascinating. You don't get rid of the hierarchy. In fact, you almost emphasize the differences in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
But you give it completely new meaning. You take away the command and control kind of meaning and give the right kind of autonomy at the different levels.
Yeah, and it actually, you know, when you think about it, it becomes a form. In fact, I'm just writing a thing right now about servant leadership. It becomes a form of servant leadership. So the senior managers are now there to serve. They're there to make sure that the people have got the right resources and the right information, because largely the people at the top get the information first, with the exception of the instant feedback. So they'll know what's going on globally. Their job is to make sure that the information's flowing down and that people have got the right information at the right time, and to make sure they've got all the resources that we can muster. And as a gold leader, your job is, particularly in a crisis situation, so I've been involved in a few around the world, is to find and supply the resources, beg, borrow and steal. You're looking at your people, so they can get on with their job and they can start innovating and start using the feedback immediately from that crisis in order to form a new world order, basically a new way of operating.
It's so interesting. It can be a what's the word? I suddenly got it. A pivotal, not pivotable. A pivotal moment in the life of a leadership team. About 3 years ago, I worked with the leadership team of a petroleum company. They literally make petrol. And they had a huge crisis at one of their petrol tanks. The roof was giving in and it was going to collapse. And it's a very dangerous situation because this thing can explode. And then the whole town is in deep crisis. And what these leaders, the executive team managed, who used to be quite microcontrollers, is to not manage this crisis. Is they got the information that the actual experts were involved, and then the leadership team got involved, but only as what you would call level one. So they went in there with bores and hammers and stuff, and they were commanded by the rest of the team. So if a leadership person went into that space, they were subject to command by whoever was leading that space.
Good, yeah.
And it was an awakening for them to see that this could actually work, and it works much better, and it builds it builds the strength of the organization in that moment.
Yeah, and any fast moving change, you know, we're not just talking about disasters here and, you know, large scale events. Any fast moving change, you know, where's the feedback coming into the organization? Well, it's the people who are connected to the outside world within the organization. So, you know, the telephone operators, the salespeople, the practitioners, whoever it is, they're the people who are seeing the early signs of change. They're the people who are seeing the reaction of the customer. You know, they're a huge resource, and at that point, the management need to kind of start switching from a form of management and micromanagement and telling people what to do into more of a facilitation role. And it's that becomes important.
Yeah. I guess one of the big challenges in organizations in dealing with this is this challenge of learned helplessness.
Oh.
So they have created contexts in which people don't believe that they can act and actually be autonomous, etc. I only yesterday learned that the word learned helplessness will come from Martin Seligman. And then it comes from that horrendous experiment that they did with the dogs.
Yes.
But, that's beside the point. I'm quite shocked about that. But
yeah, but organizations create learned helplessness.
Yeah.
So we've got, let me show you this. So this is something that's in the next book that I've got coming up. So hang on, let me just save that. We'll create a new one. So if you look at any kind of situation of change, whoops, wrong way, I don't want that. Any kind of situation of change itself brings about higher levels of uncertainty on the assumption that that change is moving into a place that we've never been before. So on this axis here, we've got uncertainty. Oops. Yeah, uncertainty, right. And then when we start to look at people's emotional reactions, so the word you used is emotional maturity, and it's certainly a term that I would go with. So in terms of increasing levels of emotional maturity or emotional intelligence, so or emotion regulation skills. So, and then, whoops, I didn't spell. Right, okay. So what we find is what organizations do, right? So organizations, the larger it gets, what they do is they start simplifying things. So a 1 or 2 person band startup, they do everything. You know, if it's your own business, you're the marketing executive, you're the sales, you're the accountant, you know, you do the operations, you do product development, you do everything, right? So there's no delineation, there's no nothing. And you know everything that's going on because you're doing it all, right? And you're the person who's connected to the outside as well, and you're trying to make the business work, so you're working on the business and in the business and all the rest of it. As the organization starts to grow in size, what we find is that the organizations then start to delineate. So they form departments and functions. So we have a HR function, an accounting function, and sales and operations, and we have an R&D function and all the rest of it. We split these people up. And what we do is we start creating a whole series of, so we create a structure, an organizational structure, usually with somebody at the top. It's some form of hierarchy, usually, not always, but usually 90% of the time. And we start creating policies and procedures and systems. Now, when you think about it, what are those things doing? And what they are is they're proxies for decision making. So they're saying, if you're in accounts, you only make decisions about finances. And only these decisions you make any bigger decisions you push up to the senior executive or your manager or whatever it is. So what we're actually doing as an organization develops is we're controlling the decision making. And that's and the policies and procedures and systems are saying which decisions you can make and which decisions you can't make.
Mm.
So we're actually taking decision-making capability away from people. You don't have to make all these decisions. You just make them in this little area. And the bigger the organization gets, the smaller your area is. And we start to, horrible American word, routinize. We turn those decisions into routines.
Mm.
This is how to do this, whatever it happens to be, how to do these sales, how to do these presentations. We create routines in the organization.
So that people don't even have to make decisions.
Yeah, they're just, it's a bit like being at McDonald's, really, working at McDonald's. You just have to follow these processes. And then there's the odd little thing that you have to make a decision about that a machine can't. Right, okay.
It's actually a phenomenal process of alienation that takes place for people inside an organization.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And when you think about what it's actually doing is, it's trying to reduce the uncertainty.
Mm.
It's trying to create a system that's as certain as possible, that creates a certain output in terms of profit, in terms of product, in terms of service, in terms of quality, because I want to know when I buy a car that it's of, you know, if I'm buying this kind of car, I'm having, or a computer or whatever it happens to be, I have certain expectations, and I want that quality not to be very variable. You know, if I buy a BMW, I expect a good car. If it's not, then my faith in the company starts. So we're trying to create certainty for the client or the customer through certainty in the organization. So we're creating all these things of certainty. So what we're actually doing in terms of all of this is what we call or what I've termed here is a zone of stasis. Oops. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Dyslexia rules. Right. So we create this zone of stasis where there's lots of certainty. So people come to work, they know exactly what they're going to do. They're going to be doing, because you're an accountant, you're not going to be doing product development, and you're not going out and doing sales. And I quite like that, thank you very much, because most of the population likes the certainty. Now, whether that's because they just like it, or whether that's because the way that we've developed organizations has created that, is uncertain at this moment in point. You don't need a lot of emotion regulation here, because you know what you're doing.
Yeah, you took away the need for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this can, as long as outside conditions are stable, this can go on for a long, long time.
Mm.
But, and this
interesting. I wonder how long it can go on. Just given what eventually happens inside human communities, and how it will become boring over time, and then you will start to have little politics and
that's why a lot of the politics happens in undynamic organizations, because we're bored. You know, what else are we get? Oh, let's, we've pulled the legs off the spiders, let's try each other. So we get that kind of thing going. So we get this pull into certainty by the organizations, and you get why they're trying to create stability so they can have a stable output in terms of profit, products, services, whatever it happens to be. And that makes sense. But organizations are sitting in a paradox, and if they don't recognize a paradox, they're in trouble. So I get that. I understand why you would do that. And that's why it's called an organization. It's organized, right? But the organize also has an unintended consequence. And the unintended consequence is you don't need to be resilient to operate here.
Mm.
So if we don't practice that resilience muscle, if we don't have uncertainty, if we don't have to step out of our comfort zone very often, you lose the capability of doing it, and it becomes scary. So, right now, let me just push that aside for a second. And
it's interesting that I mean, when I think of large bureaucracies, I often think of places that are emotionally quite stunted, and in which no more real connection is possible, because real connection actually requires a degree of uncertainty and openness to uncertainty. But it's all been designed out of that system.
Yeah.
To the extent that it's possible.
And well, and if you know, they don't want emotions. You know, anybody who's emotional in the organization, people go like, you know, don't cry in my office. Oh my God, that's uncomfortable, or whatever it happens to be. So we get to a situation where the display of emotions becomes unwanted. You know, and that's not emotionally intelligent. You know, so suppressing emotions, or you know, so we, you know, there's a whole load of work about emotion labor and the effect that has. So that work, that research started out with things like so hospitality, for example. You've got to smile regardless of what you feel. Doesn't matter what you feel. When you're dealing with a customer, you're smiling and you're being happy, regardless of how you feel, regardless of how we're treating you, regardless of what's going on in your life. So, and it started out with that. Now, what's happened over the last few years in terms of the research in emotional labor is it started to turn inwards. And well, it's been a big realization for the last kind of 10 years, but it's growing, that actually just working in an organization, most organizations, is an act of emotional labor, because you've got to come to work with a certain set of emotions. There are other emotions that are not acceptable in this workplace or in this culture. And we're starting to see the effects of that in terms of stress. You just can't be who you are, really. You've got to go to work with a smile. You've got to be upbeat. You've got all those kinds of things, even if you're not feeling it. Now, some organizations are a bit more emotionally aware and go, yeah, okay, you know, your cat's died, your mother's died, just go home, you know, or fine. You know, if you don't want to talk to us, that's fine. Just go and sit in there. If that's how you want to do it, just let us know how you want to operate. And if there's anything we can do to help, that's fine, rather than ignoring it. Right. So emotional labor is being recognized as an organizational issue, not just a outside facing thing. So we create this kind of thing. Now, let's just move outside the organization now, and we start to have a look at a thing called strategic drift. So we have this kind of situation where we create a strategy. So we look at the leadership, look at what's happening. We decide where we want to be in, I don't know, 5-10 years time, whatever it happens to be. Let's say they're cautious, and it's a 5-year strategy. Right? And right now we're here in terms of time. Right? So what we do is we say we want to be here in 5 years time. We're here right now. And the obvious thing to do is say, right, what actions can we take that will get us there? And we create a strategy. These are the kinds of things that we're going to do at these points in order to move to this situation in 5 years' time. Makes sense. Absolute sense. And that strategy then becomes embedded within the organization. We create the structures around it, policies, procedures, and that's it, which is fine. But the world's not going to, firstly, the world doesn't read your strategy. The second issue is the world's moving.
They're just like your employees. They don't read the strategy, the world.
You're right. Absolutely right. But the world's shifting, right? And it's shifting in lots of directions. So in terms of time, it's moving over here. We've got technological change, we've got political change, we've got economic change, we've got market change, social change. All of these things are constantly evolving and changing. New computer system, new form of AI, new competitors, right? And you can see what's going on here is soon as you've set your strategy, the world's off on here and we're off on that direction. And there comes a point, usually a crisis point in the organization, of losing sales or flatlining sales, what that's saying is that our offering is no longer actually part of the real world. We're out of date. So we end up having to move the organization with another strategy where we set it off again here. So we start the whole process again, where we go after 2.5 years, we go, we need a new strategy. Let's have another 5-year strategy. And so we get these episodic processes of change in organization in order just to catch up. And this is what's termed strategic drift. So that, without the incremental change that's always going on anyway, creates these episodic processes of change. So we decide as an organization, we're going to have some kind of change. We're going to have to rejig things. Our products we need new products, we need new business, whatever it happens to be. So the moment we do that, we create uncertainty. And what we're doing is we're moving these people out of here into an uncertain place. These people who prefer working here. And now we're asking them to operate in brand new areas, brand new ways to do things differently, to do things with different people and work in different combinations and things like that. And that we've made them less resilient. So what's going to happen up here? We're going to get a whole series of emotional reactions to this change, which aren't positive because they're not in control of the change, remember, right? So we end up in what I've termed the F zone, which is the fear zone. And we have a number of different reactions to this, which are avoidance. Right. We have freezing. And then we have aggression. The three reactions to fear reactions. And what happens is people bounce up here for a while until the organization works out how to operate in this new world. And then slowly we get some new policies, new procedures. People start getting used to working in their new department or their new construction or with new people because we've just made a load redundant or whatever it happens to be. Slowly we start to reduce the uncertainty, and what we're doing basically is we're just moving straight back down here. And you know, if you've been in any organization long enough, you'll recognize these episodic changes. There's all hell on for a little while, and then things calm down, everybody gets back to work, and then a few years later it happens again.
I guess if this happens in rapid succession,
yeah,
and to some degree unmanaged, whatever that may be, that this persistence of fear and the reactions of avoidance, freezing, and aggression come to feel to people like being traumatized.
Yeah.
In a constant process of being disrupted, not having a stable world in which you can interact with each other and with your customers and with the organization as a whole.
Yeah, yeah. And we know that if people have had a bad experience of change previously, their resistance to change increases significantly. There's a lot of research around that.
Yeah, it just carries the old expectations into the new situation.
And we get stuck in these cycles and they just keep happening. But it doesn't have to happen like that. So let's just have a look at what happens in an organization that's more agile and where people are more emotionally resilient. Is what we find is that, and we'll just start up here. Let me get a different color here. So if you're in a change situation with people who are happy with change, who are more emotionally resilient, and they like change because they see it as an opportunity for experimentation, trying new things, those kinds of things, what we find is in here a lot more experimentation. We find people trying new things, research, innovation, and creativity.
Fascinating. It's a definite kind of organization that we can set up.
Yeah.
In which innovation and creativity almost becomes more the norm.
But it's based on this, on people having emotion regulation skills, being used to change a lot more often. And then what happens is the same thing happens here, is that as they get hold of the new world situation, exactly the same thing happens, is that the organization, because it needs stability, actually starts to reduce it. This creates knowledge. We start to understand what the new world is. We start to understand what the technologies are, what the opportunities are, and things like that. And what that does is it drives us back down to a situation. Whoops, hang on, didn't mean to do that. And it drives us back down here now. And this is where the problems start to occur. We've got all these people up here who are enjoying the challenge, enjoying creativity, enjoying creating new things, finding out what's going on, learning. Learning's a big part of this. The organization gets hold of it, turns it into systems because it has to, right? And basically what it's trying to do in effect is it's trying to move the organization back into here, stability, so it can have a stable output. Makes sense. The trouble is, all these people now are getting bored and they feel devalued because they're being asked to be like robots. And they don't like being like that, so they've got a problem. They do one of two things. They either start becoming disruptive by trying to get back up there and create innovation when stability is now required, and the management don't like that, or they go, stuff this for a game of soldiers, I'm off, and they leave. And you've just lost all of these people. They become consultants or whatever it happens to be, they're off. And you've lost a huge resource. And
it makes me think of what Dave Snowden says, that when an organization goes to the simple world, it goes to die.
Yeah, goes to the dark side. Yeah. And the challenge here is, and the question is, how do we create, whoops, hang on. How do we create a, can I do that and turn that around? Don't know. Right. Anyway, you get it, I think. Don't know. How do we create an organization that actually sits on this axis here, where people, and just in here, where people are out of there, we're creating some certainty because we need that. The organization needs it. The quality of the products and services need it and everything. But how do we create an organization where we keep these people, but we have this ability here to be able to move between these two places? And one of the things that has been kind of a feature of a lot of my work is around decision making, and what decisions you allow people. Remember that thing about gold, silver and bronze, right? How we allow people to make decisions. So if we start to think about decisions within organizations, we can stratify them. There are different types of decisions. So we have, right, let's just get a different color here. Yeah, there we go. So we have, it's a horrible color. Not sure that's brilliant. Let's just change that. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, that'll do. Right. So we have what we call critical decisions, and they're critical because if we get those wrong, the business goes, we lose it, right? And the golden rule with critical decisions is no one person makes a critical decision. And you look at, do you remember Nick Leeson, the guy who brought down Barings Bank?
Yeah.
He, as an individual, was playing with so much money, he was making critical decisions for the organization, and he shouldn't have been. These are board decisions. These are joint decisions. You never make a critical decision on your own because you're not seeing everything, which we've already explored. So critical decisions stay in the organization, and they're a team effort. We then have a group of decisions that are not critical as such, but they're dangerous for the organization. In other words, they're costly. So if you get these things wrong, They're not going to bring the organization down, but they're going to cost a lot, right? Again, same rule applies here. These are joint decisions. They may not be at board level, they're at departmental level, right? So the department, the management part of the organization, they make those decisions. And that's fine. We can see those, because if we get this wrong, then there's it's going to cost the company a lot of money. And therefore, oops, somebody's mic's on, I think. Right. And then lastly, there's another set of decisions, and these are the ones that I've become really, really interested in. And these are the decisions that are not costly, they're not critical, they're operational, day-to-day decisions. And if you get them wrong, so what? It'll cost a few quid, right? So these are the decisions that you leave with people. You do not turn them into policies, procedures, and things like that. You let people keep making decisions, keep making mistakes, because failure is a big part of this. These people up here are very comfortable with failure. These people are not. And what we're trying to do is grow their comfort with failure. But we don't want these people innovating all the time, but they'll be quite happy if they've got stuff to play with. So what we're trying to do now is create a group of decisions, identify the decisions in the organization that we're not going to control, that are neither critical nor costly, that individuals can just take on a day-to-day basis. And if you get them wrong, fine, but try to innovate, try to make them better. Don't just follow the procedures. So these are what we call non-procedural.
This is fascinating. It's an organization design response to challenge and almost ordering your decisions through a filtering kind of process.
Yeah.
That I'm very conscious that we've got about 10 minutes.
Sorry, we're going all day about this stuff.
Yeah, we could go on. This is fascinating. If there are questions, I'd love to hear any.
Yeah, we'll stop now.
Any questions? We've got 10 minutes for a few questions. If anyone wants to pop up their hands, shout something, make a comment.
And I'll save all these and then I'll share them. You can. So.
That's fantastic. We're also recording this, and it will be put up for anyone who wants to go through this very fascinating. I find this very interesting. And very interesting that we shift the focus in a way to this key thing that we do in organizations, which is to make decisions collectively or individually.
Yeah,
and find the balance and how to decide what to control and what to not control. Yeah. Nikki, I see your hand is up.
Hi. Thank you so much for this fantastic session. Yeah, absolutely, Christo. It speaks to org design, and it speaks to how we respond to certain contexts in the organization. And just my quick comment there, referencing wonderful learning at World's View through Dave Snowden of the Connecting framework, and it just seems like there's a natural linkage. Do you reference the Connecting framework in some of your work? Does that come to bear in some of the exercises and case studies that you go do in your workshops? Just a question.
Yes, I know, David. Yes is the short answer to that. And there are connections, and certainly a lot of the work that David's done around complexity and the difference between that and it being complicated, and the whole framework that he's got actually is a very useful way of thinking about some of these things. I've kind of come at it. So I met David, I think, when I was at Cranfield first. So a lot of the kind of the uncertainty stuff, and that's how I came across David, was when I started with the whole kind of uncertainty, looking at uncertainty and realizing really, and so the book that I published in 2006, The Ambiguity Advantage, the kind of punchline of that really is around emotional intelligence and emotional regulation skills and things. And we've kind of developed a long way since then. We understand a lot more about what creates that. There's been a lot of research into how to develop greater levels of emotion regulation skills individually, but also within organizations. And a lot of that is around these things around decision making, allowing people to make a broader spectrum of decisions, things about their jobs, stuff like job crafting and those kinds of things, larger levels of autonomy, so people are used to doing those things. And then when disaster strikes, or there's a low brain's gone dead there, a low, what did I call it? Anyway, yeah, high impact event, then they're prepared and they're already being able to be autonomous, and they're already being able to make decisions and test things, and that's what's important. But yes, I agree.
Okay.
David, it seems like that we can't, even if we are in the crisis and our people don't have resilience, we have to start somewhere to build this, to give the space for the development of this capacity to at least take the step of making some difficult decisions, and so that people can learn to make decisions in organizations.
Yeah, and certainly pushing autonomy down further, not making decisions for people, trying to stop this kind of over policification in organizations help. And you'll be amazed what people can do in a crisis. You've got to watch them. Now, I don't mean watch them in terms of control. I mean, watch them in terms of support, because some people might fall over and they're going to need support, emotional support, but also kind of support around trauma and things like that. And so it's a support watching rather than a control watching. It's a completely different process.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I mean, David Petrieri recently wrote about, we're so obsessed with leaders being visionary, but how about leaders just holding the space?
Yeah, and being facilitators.
Yeah, being facilitators.
Definitely. Yeah, cool, brilliant. Any other questions? Encourages such a peaceful work environment. Gives structure that builds confidence. Yes. Yeah.
David, it sounds like we can go on for another 4 hours, well, another 2 hours, and then another 4 hours, etc., etc. I'm really grateful for you joining us this morning. I actually hope we will do this again and dive more deeply into some of these aspects. But you and I will stay in conversation. I just want to say this was like really interesting. Fascinating, the experience that you bring to this, as well as the reading. It's quite phenomenal. And I, for one, really enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Yeah. Love it. Anyway. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. That was interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, I see the comments coming.
That's nice.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Really great.
Yeah, pleasure. Thank you.
Cool. So we'll see you next week, everyone. Next week we're chatting to Julia Cookart. Liesl is chatting to Julia, and we're talking about death.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a great session.
Thank you.
Bye.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Lisa, you want to say anything about next week for those who still...
Unfortunately, I'm unable to say exactly what the topic will be, but it has to do with death. And the reason we thought that would work at the moment is because of what's going on around us. So it's the death of organizations, of the feeling of being part of a team, of working in certain environments, of some of the stuff that David said, where you kind of married to your way of doing things because you put so much effort in. It's the death of that. It's the death of whole organizations. It's all the retrenchments and the restructuring. But there's also the death of people around us in this virus. And I think the magic that Julia brings is the work they've been doing for years now in identity maturity. And the research she's doing for her PhD on leadership stuckness and the other identity work. She's got so much data on what people say and feel and think about death, that she's gone to draw all of that data for us to see what the themes are and what comes up. And by the end of today, she needs to tell me what the topic is going to be. So if that enticed you, then please come back next week.
It'll be fascinating. The great existential question of death.